changing. It was like Lynn's description of Berkeley when she and John were there in the 60s. That's probably still, you're saying, probably still the case, and I think that's one of the questions. How much has it changed? Is it changing? And if so, to the extent that it is, what difference does that make for BYU, for us as part of BYU? What are the implications? And I'd love to get the panel to at least comment on that. What are the implications, given what we've just been saying about an LDS perspective or an emerging one, or what's unique about us, given that the Academy is perhaps opening up some more, that there is, and they talk about those characteristics as at least we ought to be like gays and lesbians and at least at the table. Whether they respect us or not, it's a different world. It's a world where we're in a dialogue, maybe a clamorous dialogue, is to Sandel's language at Harvard. But at least we're at the table, supposedly. What does that do for us? For good or for ill? Anybody want to comment on what are the implications for BYU, given this change that they're mapping, the emergence of at least some openness to religion, to religious discussion, from secularist, where there is no inclusion of religion, to secular, where religion is one of the facts of nature, one of the facts of our life. Comments? Richard?
Well, I think overall it's a good thing. I mean, I think it's especially a good thing for students and probably for faculty who feel able to be more fully themselves and get some nourishment spiritually. I'm a little wary because in the New Testament, I think there's a scripture that says, "He who is not against us is for us," and one that says, "He who is not for us is against us." So we have to pick our compatriots carefully. I think one of the dangers of academia opening up is what you can't defeat, you assimilate. And if we're not really careful, they could have, the discourse could take some turns that delete from it all of the things we wanted to accomplish by getting it as part of the discourse. And for Latter-day Saints, I think it's a good thing. We partner with who we can, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I think our associations with other faiths is sort of like the dangers of having a cat for a pet, because if it's big enough, it would eat you. So I think we're in a unique position, but I'm all for it. I think it's great.
You're all for it, sort of. Depending on the size of the cat and how sharp the claws are, it sounds like. Other comments?
Okay, well, I have written down here, if the role of religion is changing, what does this imply for BYU? And I wrote down, not much.
Say some more.
We're just a little weird, and we probably have always been more open to this than any other university in the country, except maybe some small colleges that are like us.
You don't see it changing much here.
I don't see how it could change very much. It's not our students.
That's right. And
our students come with a religious background and a desire for meaning already.
Any other comments from the panel? Yvonne?
Well, I would say in my discipline it's difficult to engage scholars at other universities on the topic of religion, but you can engage them often on processes and principles related to the avant-garde versus traditional values. I think a lot of 20th century art, for example, was throwing out the old and devaluating all of the traditions surrounding what was then the visual arts, or even music, as we've seen, or even theater. And there's a lot of experimental stuff going on out there in theater and music and visual arts and dance that we probably have to sort of step back from and say that wouldn't be the kind of thing that an LDS scholar would engage in. It's too controversial. It would never run here at BYU, nor should it. But on the other hand, I find it interesting right now that outside of the Academy, there's a wellspring of activity surrounding notions like beauty and traditional values that have been upheld for centuries, before certain conceptual artists devalued those. And so I find that encouraging, and I find that those conversations are able to happen, and often happen where you find that there is a commonality of traditional goals and traditional values and a sense of meaning and a sense of belief that surrounds those kind of virtues. And I think all of us would say, is there one of us in here that wouldn't be moved by music or by the arts in some way in our religious and weekly devotions?
In some ways, we're becoming avant-garde as the terrain, because we're like the Indians with their artifacts and music or something that is now, it's avant-garde to pay attention and to that diversity and be at the table. So
it's been out of vogue long enough that now it's...
now
it's
like an old tie, it's maybe coming back into... Are there, Jim, okay, other comments about that, please?
Well, I think that the opening of the Academy has had huge implications in my own work.
Which is what?
I'm in education, and I look at how my students' spiritual beliefs influence their work with multicultural students and English language learners. And I've had multiple experiences as I've presented my work, either in publication or at different academic conferences, where people have come up and said, I can't believe you're from BYU. You're so open-minded. You're thinking of these things. And it's, for me, all about missionary work, because I'm doing nothing that, I'm just doing nothing uncommon. This is what we do, but people don't know about it. Or people, stereotype us. And so I think as we increasingly bring our beliefs, now it works really easily in my field, perhaps not so easily in other fields, but as we bring our spiritual beliefs and those of our students into our research or into our methodology, like Stephanie was talking about, we have more and more chance to show that to the world at large and have those kinds of responses. And I welcome those and I love them because they change people's minds about what Mormons are, about what BYU does, and it builds bridges, but not in ways where the cat can eat me, because I've established what I am first and what I believe first. And then they're coming to me and saying, well, I didn't know we had that in common, or those concerns, or whatever they are. So I see it as a real missionary opportunity.
Thank you. Craig?
Just picking up on something Richard said, in our doctrinal discussions, we've got our own jargon and way of talking about things. The dialogue has been going on for a long time. But if you move into, for me in the business world, when we talk about ethics and the interaction with others, if we think we have an insight from our gospel, it's not for us to bring them into our jargon and our dialogue, but for us to go into theirs and figure out, is this an idea that actually stands up, given the best thinking, the best of the literature? And if so, it's going to stand on its own 2 feet in that jargon and in that setting, and will be an influence there for discovering better ways of thinking.
It's a key trade-off for us, isn't it? That is part of the implication for us now in this changing religious world. An opening to dialogue is an invitation to get into that public square and have the conversation, but now we're declawed in that, and I'm thinking of the example of it's President Packer when he's here getting an EDD, I think, and he's sitting in a class, and they're having a philosophical discussion. It probably was about metaphysics, or and I think it was about faith and reason, as a matter of fact. But he says for several days, this debate goes on, and he and one other person in the class are squaring off, and he's trying to defend the value of prayer and enlightenment that comes from other sources. And the other person is taking a philosophically very different point of view, and they each have their second. And after 2 or 3 of these sessions in class, the second of the other person in the class stops President Packer as he's leaving the class and says, "You're losing the debate, aren't you?" And he says, "Yeah, you're right, I am." He's trying to put it in philosophical language, and the other man said, you know why, don't you?" "No, help me." "You're out of context." And his point was, you're using the wrong language. And as President Packer came back and started talking about prayer and faith and action and keeping the commandments and what's happened to him, he carried the day in that group. So how much of this, when we talk about Prop 8 and where we stand on gay and lesbian issues and what's doctrinal and what's not, these are not, and I'm looking at Lynn over here who goes out and does a whole lot of that from a legal point of view. This is not easy to be in the public square with a set of beliefs and dealing with okay, here's me, and I can share my language, but they don't understand all that language. How do I do that, and how do our students do that in an ethical setting? The opening of the academy is an opportunity, but is it one that we're prepared to take? And how far does it go? It's fraught with some danger, I suspect. Yeah, Steve?
Tim, this might be something that would be good for you to address. I think we're talking about, in my mind, there's a difference.
Stand up, Steve.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Sorry.
Jim,
Thank you, Jim.
Talk about this a little bit. In my mind, there's a difference between being an apologist and being a critical scholar. And this approach that I think Richard's been talking about, you've been talking about, is kind of more an approach an apologist would use, in the sense of, I've already accepted this as being true for other reasons, and I'm going to look to my scholarship to support this position I've already taken. Whereas, as a scholar, most of us have been trained to say, I'm going to start with a blank slate, I'm going to gather the data that I can find within the restrictions of my discipline and say, okay, where does that lead me? What does that say? And maybe we need both approaches here. Maybe Hugh Nibley would be the classical example of an apologist, where he just said, this is true, let me go out and see what I can find that supports this. But I think we've had successful LDS scholars that have also taken the other approach. And I'm kind of curious about, do both work here? Do we have an obligation as LDS scholars to just be apologists and start from revealed truth and then work out from there where we ought to go?
Can I,
Please.
Immediately, I've never considered myself an apologist, because for me the process is a little different from saying, okay, this is what I know to be true, now how do I defend it? The process for me has been, this is what I know to be true, and if it is true that it ought to work, and let me look at what the other theories are saying and doing and what they apply. So the goal isn't to defend this by my scholarship. The point is to do good scholarship in terms that come right. Now, I have a personal confidence of what that will be, but in response to Craig's earlier question, I don't need to be a religious philosopher to do this. I just need to be a darn good academic in my own field. And then that ties in with your question. I guess my approach is, I do not and have never loved nor respected ideas. I refuse to. I love and respect people, and people are often affected by ideas, and so I have an eye to that. But I don't set out to validate what I know to be true. This has to stand on its own merits in the discipline. And if I have trouble with something else, then we deconstruct it and show why that's a lousy idea on its own merits. So it's not classical apologetics, at least as I understand it. Sorry, Jim.
No, I don't have much more to add. I was going to say, I guess I don't see, there is a difference, I think, between what we usually think of as apologetics and saying something like, suppose you're a physicist, you know that things fall. Now, how to explain that? There could be, you could take Newton, you can take contemporary physics. There are various ways of doing it, and you can try to think about what's the best way and how to make sense of it, but you would never start from the blank slate that says, well, I don't know whether things fall. So this is going back to Richard's claim that some things are the case, and explaining how they are the case or what it means to say they are, I don't think that's really quite the same as apologetics, though I do think, if you believe in revealed religion, you do start with some things that are the case. And sometimes I don't understand what it means for them to be the case, and I have to try to figure that out, think about them.
And I want to get to Rick and then Jack back here. But part of the issue is when we're talking about homosexuality, for example, and what it means to be in a world that's changing to some extent, we've almost been disaccredited in several different programs on this campus by the APA, the American Psychological Association, that comes in and says, you don't hire gay and lesbian faculty, and you don't allow students to come who are practicing acting out as gays and lesbians, or who favor that as students, and so we're going to discredit you. And it's been nip and tuck. It's been difficult for us. We have to have a way to, on the one hand, say, this is something that is the case for us. And then do we have research that is able to demonstrate what it is we believe, and do we have a scholarly approach to how we train our students? And it turns